In this video, we will assess Bryan Johnson's hair growth topical. We'll analyze the formulation, the ingredients, the science, and then we will revise Bryan's topical in a way that might help him unlock even bigger hair gains. Finally, for anybody who wants to emulate Bryan's protocol, we're going to share a topical formulation that captures most of the upside, but at just a fraction of the cost. Let's get into it.
I started to lose my hair and go gray in my late 20s. I'm now 46. It's been a lot of hard work to keep the hair I have.
If you are not living under a rock, you might have heard of Bryan Johnson. He's an entrepreneur, a tech mogul, a multimillionaire who has refocused his life and a sizable portion of his wealth to reversing aging. He's hired a team of scientists who are helping him to assess, track, optimize every facet of his body, his brain, muscle function, skin quality, and even his hair. The costs? About $2 million per year. And he's documenting all of his successes, his failures, his learnings on his site, Project Blueprint. It's really cool. You should check it out. Bryan recently posted a video of his hair growth protocol. And in this video, we are going to assess his hair growth stack. And from the perspective of somebody who is involved in hair loss research, publishing papers and systematic literature reviews. Now, part of Bryan's protocol includes things we've already covered on this channel, low-level laser therapy and microneedling. If you want our thoughts on those, check out our video on telogen effluvium or our video covering our literature review about microneedling. For this video, I'd like to focus exclusively on Bryan's hair growth topical, because I actually think that with a few formulation tweaks, he might even unlock bigger hair gains. And for those looking for an affordable version of this topical stack that captures maybe 95% of the upside, but at a tiny, tiny cost, we're gonna cover that as well.
So genetically, I should be bald. I started to lose my hair and go gray in my late 20s. I'm now 46.
Bryan's hair loss progression and presentation suggests that he's probably facing androgenic alopecia, also known as pattern hair loss. This kind of hair loss, it's incredibly common. It's chronic, progressive, and without treatment, it usually tends to worsen, often over a series of years to decades. It's mainly driven by genes and male hormones like dihydrotestosterone, also called DHT, and there's some evidence that it can accelerate as a result of things that are linked to hair shedding or even androgen synthesis in skin. So we're talking about insulin dysregulation, stress, scalp inflammation, microorganism overgrowths, micronutrient imbalances, even conditions like hypothyroidism. If you want to deep dive into the causes of androgenic alopecia, check out our video about the primary versus secondary causes of hair loss. Now, a robust protocol for androgenic alopecia will typically focus on a couple things. First, lowering DHT, which you can do with the drug finasteride. And then secondly, perhaps lowering inflammatory markers that trigger hair shedding, or encouraging the increase of angiogenesis in the scalp, or targeting a whole host of other secondary factors, often with things like microneedling, minoxidil, and the works. But if you don't have androgenic alopecia, these treatments, they're going to be far less relevant to you. To learn why, you should see our video on hair loss types. So before you try to emulate Bryan's hair loss stack, you have to make sure that this is actually your hair loss type. So watch that video, get a proper diagnosis, and then if you fit that criteria, potentially consider what he's doing. I personally love to assess hair growth ingredients through the lens of three key metrics. So we're talking evidence quality, regrowth potential, and long-term viability. These are metrics that our research team calculates using the clinical data that's published in reputable peer-reviewed journals. If you want to see the exact calculations for any ingredient, any formulation of that ingredient, I will share a link with you below. We also dive into this in our video about how to fix hair loss in men, but at a high level, here is what you need to know. For any hair growth topical, if you prioritize the ingredients that have an evidence quality score above 50, a regrowth potential greater than 1, and a long-term viability score of greater than 2, you're giving yourself a high chance of success. In fact, for most topicals, if you eliminated all the ingredients that failed to meet that criteria, chances are you'll probably maintain about 95% or more of your hair gains while simultaneously massively lowering your costs. So if we were just to apply that logic to Bryan's formula, it would leave us with a topical that looks like this. Now, That change alone will cut down on costs. It might maximize upside while minimizing unknown risks. But of course, there are more tweaks we should consider. So let's get into the ingredients one by one and go through some potential adjustments. Okay, caffeine. Very limited data and clinical studies suggest that topical caffeine is roughly as effective as 5% minoxidil, at least for some hair parameters. But those studies showed statistical improvements to a number of endpoints and yet no before and after photos with cosmetic results. To our team, this suggests that topical caffeine, it probably only leads to microscopic levels of hair regrowth for the average user, not visible cosmetic hair gains that really change the way that you see your hair. Finally, I'm assuming that Bryan's team settled on a 1% dilution based on this study, which showed that 5% minoxidil plus 1% caffeine plus 1% azaleic acid worked better than 5% minoxidil alone at improving hair outcomes. And of course, those other ingredients I just listed, they're also featured in Bryan's topical. We'll get to them soon. But overall, caffeine, probably small upside, but not major downside. Well-studied, long-term data. Let's keep moving on. Okay, finasteride. Oral finasteride is an FDA-approved drug for androgenic alopecia, and at doses of 1 milligram per day, that drug can lower the hormone DHT by more than 60%. And as a result, slow, stop, or partially reverse hair loss in about 80 to 90% of men. But of course, for some people, a small percentage, that will lead to side effects. So people often turn to topical formulations of finasteride when they're trying to better localize the effects of that drug mainly to the scalp rather than the full body. And in doing so, hopefully reduce that risk of experiencing those adverse events. Now, I am fairly certain that Bryan's team picked that 0.25% dilution based on these studies, which tested that dilution of finasteride and collectively showed that it could reduce scalp levels of DHT, achieve hair regrowth comparable to oral finasteride, and also lead to less systemic DHT reductions in the full body overall versus oral finasteride. But if this is how Bryan's team is reaching their formulation, there is a small problem. Bryan, according to the label, is applying 1 milliliter daily of his topical. For hair loss serums, you can approximate your total drug exposure by multiplying the milliliters daily that you apply times the drug dilution in milligrams. For Bryan, that 0.25% finasteride at 1 milliliter is about 2.5 milligrams of total finasteride exposure daily. But those studies, they actually applied a far smaller volume of finasteride each day, with participants' total daily drug exposure ranging from as low as 0.2 milligrams to 1 milligram. So Bryan's actually applying between 2.5 to 25 times more finasteride each day than those studies suggest, despite the matching dilutions. The volumes of application are just so different. Now, studies also show that when you apply 2.275 milligrams daily of topical finasteride, you actually lower your blood levels of DHT, that's a proxy for systemic absorption, by as much as if you were to just take 1 milligram orally of finasteride. So all those topical studies purported benefits of better drug localization, the reduced impacts on systemic hormones. Bryan's dose probably is too high to capture those benefits. So because of this, it's reasonable to suggest, well, maybe Bryan should just use oral finasteride, right? Well, maybe not. Here's why. For those who tend to get finasteride side effects, there are likely two factors worth tracking. The first is your serum DHT levels, which can act as that proxy for systemic absorption of the drug when it goes from the scalp into the system. Based on the dosages that Bryan's using, we can probably assume that his blood levels of DHT are probably just as reduced as if he were to use the oral medication. But there is a second factor worth considering. It's the amount of circulating finasteride in your bloodstream. That's the amount of finasteride that hasn't yet interacted with any organ sites in your body, but that will travel to other organ sites outside of your blood and eventually have an effect. One topical study on finasteride showed that even up to 0.9 milligrams daily of topical finasteride exposure, participants still had circulating levels of finasteride that were 100 times or more lower than the oral formulation. In that regard, we've also worked with a lot of people who said they couldn't tolerate 1 milligram of oral finasteride because of side effects, But then when they switched over to 0.1% to 0.3% topical finasteride at 1 to 2 milliliters daily, despite their serum DHT levels being equally suppressed on both formulations, they said they didn't have any issues there. So is this due to the nocebo effect of oral finasteride and then the placebo effect of switching to topical? That's possible. Or is it actually due to lowering your circulating levels of finasteride with a topical formulation despite it being higher dose? I think the evidence suggests that's also possible. And I think that Bryan can actually tease this out. So here's what we'd recommend to him. First, get a blood test for your circulating levels of finasteride. If you're seeing circulating levels that are orders of magnitude lower than what you'd expect for oral finasteride, stick with the topical. It might be conferring good efficacy and a lower side effect risk for you. But if not, consider switching to oral finasteride at 1 milligram daily. And in doing so, you might not increase your risk of side effects, but you may get better global protection of hair loss across the entire scalp, because that's the way that oral medications work. They give you global protection, whereas in these topical studies, we only have areas for target area hair counts. We don't know what's happening outside of that at an objective endpoint level. So get that test, see where your levels are, and then potentially adjust your protocol accordingly. And if you want absolute or as close to as possible drug localization with finasteride, check out our video on topical finasteride, because there are some doses that you can experiment with that actually show no serum DHT changes. Let's move on to the next ingredient. Okay, topical minoxidil. It's an FDA-approved drug for androgenic alopecia. It works as a vasodilator. It alters the activity of fatty acid derivatives. It impacts potassium ion channels, and it has a track record of success in both clinical settings and the real world. We also know Bryan's formulation includes azaleic acid and caffeine, both of which might add a bit more hair gains versus minoxidil alone, at least according to that one small study. So that's all great. And we also know that he's doing microneedling. Now, microneedling helps to enhance both the penetration and the activation of minoxidil. And clinical studies suggest it can potentially double that drug's effectiveness. If you want to learn more about that, along with the proper needling depths and frequencies, check out our video covering our published literature review on microneedling for the use of hair loss disorders. So, is there anything else Bryan might want to do to further enhance minoxidil's efficacy in his topical? Maybe. Bryan could probably get a little more hair growth by increasing his minoxidil concentration up to 10%, potentially higher. Clinical studies do show a dose-dependent response for minoxidil, and the higher doses of the topical can confer with slightly better hair regrowth. In fact, if we go back to the original clinical studies on minoxidil, they applied topical minoxidil at a 5% dilution at 1 milliliter twice per day. That equals out to about 100 milligrams of daily drug exposure. Remember, Bryan is only applying 1 milliliter daily of 5%, so that's 50 milligrams daily. If he bumped up to 10%, he'd actually be just matching his total daily drug exposure that got minoxidil the FDA approval for pattern hair loss. So it's another thing to consider. The next thing Bryan might want to do is potentially add in retinoic acid, and that dilutions of 0.001% all the way up to 0.02%. This ingredient also helps to promote both the activation and penetration of minoxidil. It increases cell turnover at the level of the stratum corneum. That's the outermost layer of the epidermis. So it also helps with all other topical ingredients getting deeper into the scalp. And that might afford him some bigger hair gains. For more information on that, check out our video about how to fix hair loss in men. So to quickly recap, consider bumping up to 10% minoxidil, consider adding in low-dose retinoic acid. We think those might move the needle. All right, azaleic acid. We see this ingredient all the time in hair growth topicals, mainly because of that study we referenced earlier that combined azaleic acid with minoxidil and caffeine. But what does azaleic acid really do? Well, its popularity originally arose out of an ex vivo study showing that azaleic acid and other ingredients might inhibit 5-alpha reductase activity, and thereby DHT levels upwards of 90% in human skin. Just to be clear, a 90% reduction in DHT in the skin would be on par with some of the most powerful hair growth drugs on the planet, like dutasteride. In fact, that study was the same thing that inspired this infamous Zix formulation on hair loss forums as a natural alternative to these drugs. What companies selling azelaic acid don't tell you is that the skin samples in that study showing those massive reductions to DHT, that wasn't skin from balding human scalps. It wasn't even skin comparable to balding human scalp tissue. It was actually done using donated foreskin from parents who just had their kids circumcised. Foreskin has a relatively low density of terminal hair follicles, and it's our hair follicles where we see the highest levels of a particular type of 5-alpha reductase, type 2 5-alpha reductase, which is the type that's causally involved in the balding process in our scalps. So this 90% inhibition of 5-alpha reductase from azelaic acid, it's probably predominantly of the type 1 variety, which is the kind of DHT reduction that has less relevance to pattern hair loss. In fact, it's really type 2 5-alpha reductase that's mostly active in balding scalp regions, not type 1. So my guess would be that if you actually biopsied the scalps of people who applied azelaic acid to their heads, you'd probably see mostly mild DHT reductions, if any. And I'd also hazard to guess that the majority of benefits from that minoxidil, azelaic acid, and caffeine topical, it's probably coming from the caffeine and the minoxidil, less so the azelaic acid. After all, studies showed that doses as low as 0.2% caffeine topically can match 5% minoxidil for some hair parameters. So our recommendation, I don't think that Bryan needs this ingredient, and I don't think that he's going to hurt himself by removing it from his formula. All right, Diclofenac. This is a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug. And if any of the other ingredients that Bryan is using are causing any bit of scalp inflammation or irritation, this drug might help to offset that and then also help keep his scalp feeling healthy. There is not a ton of data on Diclofenac when used for hair growth. But what I can say is that I am glad to see this ingredient inside of his topical rather than a topical corticosteroid like fluocinolone or hydrocortisone. There is this growing trend in US-based telehealth brands where they add in corticosteroids to their prescription topicals and tell people to use them twice daily for the rest of their lives. They do this to offset the irritation from ingredients like retinoic acid. Sounds great in the short term, but there are no long-term studies evaluating if low-potency corticosteroids at that dosing consistency over years will not cause skin thinning. Of the pulse dosing studies that do exist, a notable portion of patients are reporting over 5-year periods, 2-year periods, the increase of skin thinning, spider veins, and other problems that often represent permanent histological and morphological changes to the skin itself, things that don't reverse after you stop the corticosteroid. That's not to say that Diclofenac is a perfect substitute to corticosteroids, but the fact that Bryan is using that over low potency corticosteroids at least suggests to me that his team is aware of this potential problem. So good on Bryan and his research team for being aware of this. We'll have more videos about this in the future. 5% tea tree oil. This is an antimicrobial natural extract that may also help control some pathogenic organisms associated with hair shedding. You can think of tea tree oil as a gentler version of ketoconazole. To our understanding, there is not a lot of evidence that this ingredient is going to significantly help regrow hair, but it might support, in some respects, a healthy scalp biome. In our eyes, it's probably not doing much, but potentially is worth using occasionally during flare-ups of scalp itch or scalp biome disruption. Rosemary oil. There's one clinical study suggesting that daily rosemary oil at an unknown dilution is comparable to 2% minoxidil. However, the investigators of that study never really specified how much rosemary oil you should be using. We reached out to them, we didn't hear back. It's our suspicion that the dilution might be around 1 to 5%. Similar to tea tree oil, it's probably a lower leverage ingredient, and in my opinion, if Bryan's formulation excluded it, I really don't think it would have that much impact on his hair. 0.05% Ginkgo Biloba. This is another natural ingredient. To our knowledge, there's no good data to suggest that this would help with hair growth in humans who have androgenic alopecia. And while the absence of evidence never implies evidence that something won't work, it also often means that something is understudied. And as a result, it might come with unanticipated risks in the long term. This happens just as much with pharmaceutical ingredients as it does natural ingredients. I mean, fish oil supplements were originally heralded as heart healthy. Now we know they might increase atrial fibrillation. Antioxidants were once thought to extend lifespan. Now we know they probably do very little. They might even shorten it. Beta carotene, once thought to be cancer protective. Now there are studies suggesting it increases lung cancer in smokers. Vitamin E and selenium were once thought to prevent prostate cancer until a 35,000 person study on those supplements was halted because subsets of men getting those vitamins were getting twice the rates of prostate cancer. I made this point in our video about how to fix hair loss in men. I'll make it again here. Substances of all categories, pharmaceutical or natural, can show good safety in initial studies, only for longer term data to reveal big problems in year 2, year 5, year 10. Ginkgo Biloba is probably a low leverage hair growth ingredient with little to no long-term studies at these dosing parameters. I think he can eliminate it. I don't think it would hurt his hair growth outcomes. And I think it would potentially limit his risk 2, 5, or 10 years down the line. Okay, biotin, 0.01%. The fabled biotin. We see this ingredient in almost every hair loss supplement or topical on the planet. It's clinically proven to regrow hair if you have a severe biotin deficiency driven by a genetic mutation called a biotinidase deficiency. That occurs in 1 out of 110,000 people. It also can regrow hair if you have a biotin deficiency as a lifelong alcoholic, or if you have severe gut dysbiosis and a biotin deficiency as a result of Crohn's disease. Bryan is a god of full body optimization. My suspicion is that his biotin levels are fine. He's probably not an alcoholic. He probably doesn't have Crohn's disease. If he took out this ingredient, I do not see this having any impact on his hair growth outcomes. Okay, melatonin. This is a natural hormone that is also sold over the counter in the US. There are a handful of studies showing that it can regrow hair, potentially by influencing proteins associated with the hair cycle, maybe even by lowering inflammation as well. Now, similar to Bryan's finasteride dilution, he also might have a dosing problem with melatonin. The clinical studies on topical melatonin show so far that the minimum viable dose for hair regrowth is about 0.0033% melatonin applied at 3 milliliters daily. That's about 0.1 milligrams daily of melatonin exposure, which was also the only amount in those clinical studies shown not to impact serum melatonin levels. Again, with topicals, we are often aiming for that localization effect, scalp only, minimal effect elsewhere in the body. Now, Bryan's formulation matches this dilution, but it doesn't match the milliliters applied. He's applying 1 milliliters daily, not 3 milliliters. So in this case, we'd actually recommend that Bryan up his melatonin dose to 0.01%. At a milliliter of application daily, that would equal to 0.1 milligrams of daily melatonin exposure topically, which would enable him to match the exposure volumes of that clinical study that he's emulating. As of right now, he's undershooting it. He's only getting about a third of that. So he's leaving potentially a small amount of hair regrowth on the table. All right, so let us present our revised formulation to Bryan. We can see a dilution increase of minoxidil, a dilution increase of melatonin, the elimination of these potentially poorly supported ingredients, a potential replacement of topical finasteride with oral finasteride, pending his serum DHT and circulating finasteride levels are as high as we might expect, and the addition of retinoic acid. Bryan, I love the mission. I hope you see tremendous success, and I hope that these small tweaks help you unlock another level of hair regrowth. And for those who want to emulate a similar protocol but at a fraction of the cost, consider this topical formulation. It gets down to the bare bones of what we think is driving the majority of hair regrowth. Or just consider 5% minoxidil topically, a milligram oral finasteride daily, plus microneedling. And if you want to bring your costs of that topical finasteride or topical minoxidil down to pennies on the dollar by making it at home, you can use our topical finasteride calculator, which is free, and I will link it below. Thank you for watching. I hope this video helps. See you next time.